Have you ever done something truly evil and destroyed someone's whole life? Well, I was 19 and about to graduate from high school. But then my math teacher, Mr. Cumberbatch, told me had failed his class and would have to repeat the year. I was devastated because had already made plans to go to college. So started crying and begged him to show mercy and let me pass, but he said no and shook his head. In last attempt, gave him big hug and said, "Please Mr. Cumberbatch, isn't there anything can do?" He pushed me away and said, "No, it's too late now." But showed persistence and kept begging him, saying, "Please, please, please Mr. Cumberbatch. Isn't there anything can do for you?" Finally, he had change of heart and wrote down an address on paper and said, "Okay, come here on Saturday p.m. We will do some math exercises and if you do well, I'll change your grade and let you pass." I gave him one last hug and said, "Thank you Mr. Cumberbatch, you are the best." When Saturday arrived, was very nervous. Didn't know if was going on date or if was getting private math lesson. But just to be sure, dressed myself up, put on my old school uniform, but made few changes to look as exciting as possible. When arrived at his house, he opened the door and said, "Come in, you are looking gorgeous today." Responded with, "Thank you Mr. Cumberbatch, you are looking good too." We sat down at desk and he told me to solve some math problems. But couldn't focus. Mr. Cumberbatch was so close to me and realized how attractive he was, was 19 and he was only 10 years older than me. What turned me on the most, was the authority he had over me. He could decide whether would pass the year or repeat it. At one point, just stared into his eyes and hoped he would kiss me. But guess he was too nervous. So instead, kissed him, and he liked it. Kissing my high school teacher wasn't technically illegal, but we still broke the rules of our school. Teacher-student relationship was strictly prohibited, but that's what made it so exciting. When we said goodbye to each other, asked him if had studied enough to pass the year and he said, "You have worked very hard today and therefore will let you pass." I said, "Thank you Mr. Cumberbatch," and gave him more kiss on his mouth. This might shock you, but it was my first time. And because of my inexperience, forgot to tell him to use protection. So weeks later, found out was pregnant. I didn't mind though. Because really liked Mr. Cumberbatch. The next day, went up to him at school to tell him about the baby, secretly hoped we would become couple. But when he heard the news, he got angry and said, "You will go to the pharmacy right now and get the pill." I didn't like the way he talked to me. This was my body and therefore my decision. I asked him if he was interested in raising the baby with me. But he freaked out and screamed, "I already have wife and kid. I'll never take care of your stupid baby. Go to the pharmacy right now." I screamed back, "You are married?" And he said, "Of course. And don't act like you didn't know. All my students know have wife and kid." Wow, what jerk. Not only did he betray his wife, but now he was trying to put the blame on me. I got angry and said, "I will keep the baby and tell your wife what you did." That's when he almost had seizure and screamed right at me, "You won't do that," but then had an idea. Knew would keep the baby anyway, but at least could pretend to make deal with him. Said, "If you turn all my grades into straight A's, then we'll change my mind on the baby." Mr. Cumberbatch was desperate. He agreed to the deal and sneaked into our school at night to change my grades on the principal's computer, but days later, on my graduation day, things went wrong. When my principal handed me over my reports card, he took a quick look at it and said, "There must have been mistake." I immediately knew my plan had failed and the next day got my real reports card and my grades were terrible. The only got was in Mr. Cumberbatch's math class. I knew it wasn't his fault, but was so angry, found out his address and went to his house. Woman opened the door and she was pregnant too. I asked her if she was the wife of Mr. Cumberbatch and she said yes. Then Mr. Cumberbatch appeared next to her. He stared at me in very threatening way, for moment had doubts, but then looked straight into her eyes and said, "Your husband got me pregnant and he has no interest in taking responsibility for his mistake." I hoped she would get angry at her husband. But instead she got angry at me, screaming, "You bitch, you've seduced my husband, you dirty bitch.